Hi, I'm Ali Words, and this is Last Unrifled Yaw. Last Unrifled Yaw is a podcast where we have conversations about video art, experimental music, avant-garde literature, performance art, and the occult. If you or someone you know would like to be on Last Unrifled Yaw, please get in touch. Will is a composer working in a wide variety of genres and even collaborated with our guest from episode 14, Éanna Mac Canna. We talk about music theory, film scores, dance, and magic. Hey everyone, this is Last Unrifled Yaw, and I am Ali Words. Today we have Will, who also goes by Moonpaw Prince. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Will?
Sure. I am a music producer, film composer from Belfast, Northern Ireland. I have been composing for some years now. I'm particularly interested in certain areas of production like granular synthesis, and I am interested in composing documentaries particularly.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. I've heard a little bit of your music, but what kind of documentaries are you talking about?
So you've had Éanna on the podcast. We have sort of worked together on some documentary releases. One in particular is called Yellowstone, a brief history of Belfast City Hospital. And what's interesting about that film is that we are in some way kind of interested or bound to this particular building. It was where I was born, and it's where he had undergone some treatment, and so we had sort of, collaborated on some kind of ode to showcasing the sort of history of that place, how important it is sort of for the city, and for the sort of countless people it's helped or it's informed in some way who have been, a part of that building. So there's a sort of personal layer to these things, but it's also based on research or interest of trying to, get a sort of complete overview of what these places mean, and grow to understand them and to share that understanding.
Interesting. I didn't realize that you had worked with Éanna, but I don't remember the episode number offhand, but for anyone listening, they were on a previous episode of Last Unrifled Yaw. Cool. So I guess you focus primarily in the documentary. Did you focus on like the musical side?
Yeah, completely the score.
So how do you approach scoring a documentary?
Begin with researching the documentary itself, the themes it's sort of getting at, the people, the place, the subject, and go from there. I think it's all reactionary to what the documentary is trying to accumulate, what it's trying to show. As it builds, the score should do the same. It's just the direct accompaniment to it. I think it's kind of different though to scoring a traditional film, because the documentaries tend to be more informative. So you have this kind of need to have the music almost hover or be this kind of instrumental background that I find super fascinating, because there's a paradox that kind of happens in those tracks that sort of seep into the background and they loop, and they, are dispositioned there. They kind of have another side to them. If you kind of magnify in, you start to hear the complexities it takes to sort of fall to the background and to not be the main focus, but to be this sort of emotional accompaniment, or the provider of feeling in some way. I think that's what music and documentary does. It helps just accompany the experience that is unfolding. Yeah, so I guess I approach it from the subject and sort of go from there, start to find signs that resonate and start to think about how the characteristic of playing them can be informed maybe by the subject, and it's a very personalized approach to everything that it is. It needs to be, yeah.
So did you start with, when you worked together, did you start with the music and then was the video assembled to fit the music, or was it the other way around, or was it a mix?
Typically what will happen is, while the video set is being worked on, sort of simultaneously I'll be preparing the audio or creating tracks, and there's a certain moment where both in their incompleteness they begin to merge, or you start to see, okay, this track is going to fit here, and you start to see the connections that sort of take place between audio and visual. And it's a strange sort of experience because something happens where it's just this known thing of like, okay, that's fitting here, and it's a certain puzzle is almost being complete, and there's a certain synchronicity and need for dance almost between the music and the visual. Often it feels like, as long as there's a harmony between the soundtrack and the visual itself, there will be a sort of a perfect marriage that just exists harmoniously. And that's something, sometimes it's interesting to go in and out of that. If the sort of documentary or if the film calls for it to, maybe it'll call for some sort of dissonance or exit out of sort of this expected kind of score, and that's an interesting pocket too. So I think there's so much ways to approach it and to sort of see it through that, yeah, you're simply limited by your imagination, of how you want to do it.
Yeah. How much do you think about music theory when you're making music? Or like in what ways? Some people I've interviewed, sorry to interrupt you, but some people, they just like, they don't think about it at all. They just kind of dive in and whatever comes out, comes out. Some people, they plan it all from the start. They know that they're going to use an ABA form and they're going to go up a fifth after 16 measures. And
yeah, it's funny because I started like that for sure, like no regard to any hint of music theory. It's like it didn't exist. And that mindset allowed for some, what I reflect back now on is like, that's some very jazzy moments because you're not bound by anything. And in fact, it does in some way resemble some theory in the end, if you continue to walk down that path. But what happens to, I think, a lot of people, and it's happened to me, is over time I've grown more conscious of the fact of seeing, the presence or the importance of learning more in that direction, simply because you will discover a scale. I remember discovering the Locrian scale and just making a song in it, and the sort of pleasure of just knowing or growing familiar with something new at that point in time was so affirming that these are sometimes important moments even for the musician who prefers to always improv or seeks that sort of musical freedom, that in fact a bit of music theory can maybe help unlock some more of it or push that in a different direction that you don't always need to use, but you will have another tool or another understanding of how music can be done, and that's not a bad thing. So yeah, I think I'm starting to grow more conscious definitely of that, and that has meant that maybe getting this certain new sort of standard in place where it's like, okay, I want to have something that has a polyrhythm in it, or something that has a key signature change maybe 3 times and an automated tempo, and just these next little steps or procedures to like make something new, and just always trying to challenge yourself technically just breeds great results, I feel. New creativity and new ways to do less, even grow more minimally, but in a complex way. So yeah, I'm starting to think about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I definitely like to I normally have in mind some sort of compositional technique that I want to use. Often it's more than one when I start out doing a thing, but then once I know that I'm going to use, like, for example, of the Locrian scale and a polyrhythm, then I kind of play around within those constraints I've set for myself.
So do you feel like there is a necessity to at some point maybe learn to a level of music theory?
No, I don't think there's a necessity. It depends on what you want to do. The philosopher in me says that even if you don't learn like traditional Western music theory, you end up creating music theory, even if it's just the music theory is the coincidence of which instruments and guitar pedals or whatever you pick up and the shapes your hands naturally take. You end up creating patterns, even if they're just from the shape of your body or the way that you tend to naturally move. You don't have to consciously analyze that with music theory, but the fact that those relationships, those mathematical relationships are there is true. They're there, and you can analyze them or not. And I'm a pretty analytical person, so I always tend to, if not use Western musical theory, make up my own theories of different kinds of techniques or patterns to manipulate. I'm really into like avant-garde music. So like it might even be, you could make a musical composition that's just used, maybe you have a polyrhythm of different kinds of attacks, and that's the musical composition. Like a slow attack where like the sound builds up to its peak, or a heart attack where like it strikes and it dies off. Like if you strum something that's like a heart attack-ish. And you could create almost like a rhythmic composition just like that without even worrying about what the instruments are. I guess sort of with the different attacks, or worrying about what the tonality is. Or sometimes I'll do things where each instrument gets its own tonality and its own meter, but what you do within the tonality and the meter is entirely up to what happens when you're messing around. And that is music theory, even if it's not like chord resolutions and, jazz chords, extended harmony.
I feel there's some sort of middle ground, right? Between because starting, I believe there's so much in avant-gardism, like that is your beginnings almost. That's so much of our beginnings, because originally you're constructing from this place of being fully experimental. And so I find myself starting already there in that pocket, and then I'm almost growing distant from it just to try and return in a full circle to get to that original place of I'm boundless and here with no sort of construct or rule. And I think when you break away those conditions that you had as just sort of a curious music maker was sort of like the enchanting sort of beginning of this, when you realize how much there is to learn, yet those first steps are often some of the biggest you'll make. And yeah, I believe it's a returning sort of thing to that, to grow from. I'm really fond of the music of Hiroshi Yoshimura. Have you heard of him?
My brain says yes, but there's like a number of sort of jazz-ish or jazz-adjacent Japanese musicians I listen to, but I don't remember their names precisely because they're Japanese.
Sure. Well, Hiroshi Yoshimura's got this wonderful album called Green, and it was released in 1986. And it's this beautiful ambient album that's very, as like the title suggests, very like nature-esque. And it sort of like delves into almost like the elements of earth. You have songs that represent wind and water, and there's like a US release version with like these sort of ambient field recordings added in, but I prefer the original Japanese release, which is just the tracks themselves. And when I was doing my postgrad sound design, I sort of wrote a piece on this just because I love the album so much that it's definitely struck something in me, just in admiration for him as a composer. And like it's a very beautiful album. It's one that unfortunately he didn't get to see meant so much to a lot of people in his own lifetime. It was the YouTube algorithm that kind of picked this thing up. He only kind of seen it released mainly in sort of domestically in Japan, and sort of after his death, then these albums like Green and some of his other releases of like Wetland and stuff have done great on the algorithm. And it's just great to see that they now have a new appreciation.
Yeah, I'm looking at the album covers. I feel like I've seen those pictures on YouTube. I don't know if I've clicked on them. They look familiar.
Yeah, I should give that record a listen. It's wonderful. Another one by Rei Harakami. It's called Lust, and it's a beautiful sort of music production album, instrumental release that it just has his sort of composer signature. There's these beautiful delays, and it's sort of glitchy, but not in a sort of evasive way. It's quite like a distant glitchiness to it, but it's also very well constructed and mathematical too. It's really nice. It's really beautiful music. I recommend it also. It's something I've been revisiting recently.
Yeah, I'll definitely listen to those. And for anyone listening to the show, I'm going to be putting links to any albums and things that we mentioned. But yeah, so Hiroshi Yoshimura, Green, and then Rei Harakami, Lust.
Yes.
Cool. It sounds like you went to university for something. What did you do?
I did sound design and audiovisual practice as an MSc.
How was that? Was it rewarding?
Yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed the projects of it, particularly the ones that request that you to be experimental. I thought it was a funny thing to sort of play with.
What originally drew you to being a composer?
I think I was a YouTuber originally, and there was a particular point in, well, love of music, right? It's just the obvious that comes first. It's like the team up, which is just obvious, sort of like, why would anyone want to do anything, right? It's some kind of sort of profound love or passion for something that you just can't escape. But yeah, there's maybe a point in time where being a YouTuber and realizing this is when YouTube is getting very like kind of strict on copyright and stuff, and so you couldn't use any sort of music you wanted to without getting sort of a copyright strike or your video muted. So I remember back then having this idea of like, okay, it's time to actually just compose the tracks. Why not? And yeah, it just sort of grew from there, and it just sort of went from film to film. Yeah, but I've just fallen in love with soundtracks over time too. That's just sort of made me want to do something in response to that awe that I felt maybe watching like Blade Runner or A Clockwork Orange or these films I sort of did in late sort of mid to late teenage years had been so influential. Yeah, just the response to the love for it, I guess. It's quite funny to think about. Do you have any thoughts on your relationship with music?
Yeah, I guess some of my earliest memories of being involved in music, like directly, was my family had a not very good upright piano that was never tuned. But as a kid, I would do almost like I didn't know how to play piano at that time, but I would kind of just hold down the sustain pedal and build up sort of like tone poems, I guess, where there were like obvious moods based on like how aggressively or passively we're playing and like what register. Sometimes it'd get really violent with lots of like the low notes and maybe a touch of the high, right? Just kind of like getting a feel for the way your body moves, even if you don't even know what notes to hit. That was probably the first thing that really pulled me into it. And then I guess later on when I was in college, I started reading about Schoenberg and just like the 20th century avant-garde and set theory and ridiculous numbers of polyrhythms all on top of each other, and that added an additional component to it for me. Microtonal music, especially Harry Partch. Now you got an album that I've heard a little bit of but is not yet out. Maybe you could talk about that?
Sure.
Or it might be out by the time this podcast is released.
The album is called Waterways Ireland. It was, the first draft of it was composed in 2021 in the summertime, and it sort of lay dormant until this early summer of 2023, where I just started to add to it. I've been in a very sort of piano-based mood. I've been doing some like live piano and stuff, and I've been inspired just to add sort of more things melodically. So I sat down with my Casio MT70, Yamaha YC, and some more stuff, and just sort of began to add and try and complete this album, try and really create some effort to not just sort of I'm trying to get out of this sort of idea of musical complacency, of like settling for it's good enough, although this often transitions into some kind of like botched perfectionism that never works either. But trying to really see the ideas through to their complete version is such a important thing. It takes a lot of commitment and patience to settle with an idea and not just want to release it instantly as it's made. This sort of weird urge to do that, and instead to like refine and knowing when to not overdo it. So I was kind of inspired by that process of trying to refine an album, make something that is super cohesive and is an experience ultimately that sort of can venture into like audio cinema almost. You close your eyes and it brings you somewhere, and the sounds are vibrant almost to you, and you're taken or immersed into something that is experiential.
Yeah, for sure. How do you know? So it sounds like you're spending a lot of time refining it. How do you know what to refine, or how do you know you're pushing it in a better direction?
I think you just have to realize it sort of writes itself ultimately. in the sense you sit down every time, and often it can feel like just a stream of consciousness, like you're just simply in the process of auditioning new sounds that fit this thing, that slide into the right key with the right moment. And even just because something is in the right key and it sounds like it's fitting, does it actually equal what it's there to do? Like the intention behind these sounds, like particularly if you're making a song with, say, 5 elements, you really want those to each play some meaning, especially because if we construct sort of minimally, each has so much space to take up, each has its own real landscape to fill, and that becomes so, large, as profound in nature, because you have sort of the great paradox there of like music almost constructed minimally, but you're getting a glimpse at infiniteness of it, of how far it can go, especially if it's ambient, especially if it's like some of those albums I mentioned earlier, like they just defy time sometimes, and they take us out of a sort of day-to-day life and put you into this sort of new frame of consciousness, a sort of new position, a perspective. And some of this music is interesting how it's went on to take a sort of like form in the real world. Like Hirashi Yoshimura, I believe he composed for like spaces such as like the Museum of Art, and his work would just sort of live in the museum, like it would be played and it would just inhabit the space. And I think like to composers sort of back in time, like Yannis Xenakis, who was a Greek composer, and had sort of merged music with architecture, and you can start to see the similarities between, those sort of fields, the use of mass, composition, aestheticism, and these sort of overlaps that can kind of create this interest and structure and form when music is inhabiting spaces, or it's compositions are referred to in space. There's a sort of beautiful overlap, I feel, to be explored and to continue to be explored between architecture and music.
Why do you think that is? Like, what do you think makes music in particular well suited to being integrated with or engaging with architecture, or maybe spaces in general?
I believe because music has application in the real world in regards to, it's often used for so much things, right? It's used constantly in marketing to assist marketing something to us. It's used, like a lot of these sort of musicians were essentially commissioned by large corporations to design music for commercials, for example, is another one that's coming out of that sort of era. And it feels like because it actually does have a certain a necessary presence in the real world, it's so deeply ingrained even culturally, of course. It's one of the driving mechanisms for culture. It has such a deep sort of engrossment in society and to like humanity as at large, that it can't help but not be sort of related to structure itself, like architecture, where you see like the importance, say, of like choirs and musics and church spaces, and what that sort of aids in creating the whole communal effect of those buildings and inhabiting that space in the ways it does. It that's what makes it spiritual, almost, one could argue. So you have that sort of ability to transform And if certain like sort of buildings are designed beautifully architecturally, you know, you want a soundtrack to assist that. You want something to like further enhance the space, the aestheticism itself, to almost play with the space. Considering, you know, when you place speakers, you're placing them with some kind of meaning. You're placing them in regards to knowing there's reverb, knowing there's delay at this particular position, or knowing the standard in which you're placing them. You just grow really conscious of the space itself in which the music is being played.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just wondered because there's another podcast I listen to called Weird Studies. Do you know Weird Studies?
I am not familiar.
Well, they're fun. They're I'm not sure it's fair to call it a philosophy podcast, but they're very philosophical. One of them is a musicologist, like a professor of musicology, and the other one is outside of academia, but writes about a lot of things. They also talk about the occult sometimes, but also a lot of music and literature. And there are a few episodes where they talk about how music is inherently a tactile experience compared to art, because it always places you within a sense of location. And I still think about that sometimes.
Wow.
Okay. Do you have any specific inspiration sources?
One particular that has been relatively recent has been engaging in a sort of daily long walk into the city center here, and just experiencing the passerby of every walk of life, every sort of individual, and becoming present in these sort of places and thinking about how that transitions into a composition, or how that can be described musically. Yeah, think about these sort of like chord progressions from it. Think about composing life. A sort of trick I would do if composing like an action film or something that has had, you know, certain like intense moments. I'd composed this sort of World War II film before, and a technique I like to do is do the top tempo of the song to like the heartbeat of the protagonist in the scene, or one of the actors, and sort of bring in this sort of sync that the music will reflect the direct sort of pulse of the characters themselves, and you get this sort of full experience of what it feels like to be there in the room almost. That's what the soundtrack is trying to bridge, at least. Yeah, I'm almost trying to think about how one can be inspired by life to just compose, cycle around on a bike and just see microcosms of life, nature, and allow that to play out a lot, because I feel like playing is just experience. So in order to play more, it's like to experience more, to see more, to, you know, genuinely see what it is like to just go on a sort of a nature walk, and what that does to your creativity is kind of, every time it feels like, at least for me personally, it's like that won't make a difference, but it always does. It always sort of brings in this, even though it's small and sort of feet, it's also kind of profound for creativity. It's these sort of small steps you can do. So that's been a recent inspiration. I would just say exploring a variety of art. It doesn't always have to be sort of music, but if it is, it's sort of down a sort of deep rabbit hole of like, I particularly like music that's kind of forgotten about, like the unknown artists, when they're tagged as that, where it's like there's not even really a name behind it. Just beautiful piece that's just floating in like this digital space that has never really, you know, fully seen its, so much beautiful records like that I've just slipped through the cracks. I've never really seen a huge audience or anything, but they're inevitably parts of time they're just unrecognized, or they don't have any sort of ending, and that's the poeticness about them. That's almost their lure of what brings us to love them, is the journey they've taken, but just appreciating the music itself. So it's hearing things that's collecting cassettes and keeping, a certain form of physical media, because I used to collect vinyl. It just became too sort of costly. Turns out it's not actually as great for the environment. I was told by someone I work with. And yeah, so cassettes are sort of travel friendly and stuff. So finding music through that form. Again, similar sentiment of just fragments of time. That it sort of means so much when you get you're getting to experience an album really, and it's just in this form is there's something quite beautiful about it. And painting, particularly in acrylic, has been something quite inspiring. Learning new instruments, just always sort of challenging oneself to find new approaches, find new ways to express the idea, to maybe extend the idea, to find new ways of creating.
Yeah, I do a thing where I like to cycle between these different types of creativity. Like I'll spend some time writing. Sometime might mean like during a single day, or it might mean that I have like a month where I end up focusing primarily on writing. And then I tend to move towards something else like music or dance or who knows, right? And I find that it really does add a lot to like move between different fields of creativity.
Yeah, that's so important. I think it's a perspective, isn't it? You get almost at your last sort of creative adventure that you had, say, in a particular pocket of music that you explored, and when you go into a new one, you reflect back very quickly on what that meant or what you were doing directly at. It's quite fascinating to see just this sort of your own evolution in different ways, because I don't think it stops at just maximizing one's expression at music, whatever. It's all quite universal, like the experience itself, like it can transition into so much. And it's fascinating to see one's sort of maybe signature in music be expressed in painting or be expressed in dancing as well, because it's an extension. I think that's really it's one of the most beautiful things about being human, is like literally the ability to access so much means of I guess I would call it necessary expression, because it's knowing when like it's when you know it's when you know what you want to say. I think that's a beautiful point of outputting creativity and exploring it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask me?
In terms of dancing, what do you do? Like, what is the approach? Because I'm curious.
Primarily, well, I guess you could say that I have two kinds of dance that I do at this point. I do Buto, and then there's a constructed language that I have designed for occult purposes, where every syllable of the language has a posture associated with it, so you can like dance out words or statements of intent. But Buto is it is a form of Japanese performance art dance theater that evolved out of expressionist dance, where people argue about exactly what Buto is, but at its core, you visualize and make yourself feel things so strongly that your body moves spontaneously. You don't, if it's traditional Buto, you don't have specific postures, or you don't do things the same way every time. You might visualize the same sequence of imagery and feelings and sounds within you every time for a given choreography, but your body's not going to react the same way every time. So it's more of an ecstatic practice.
Wow.
So I do a fair amount of that. And then that postural thing that I just described is called Vibebach. I've written a few books about it, not limited to the dance part, but it's just integral to how the language works and how it's expressed.
That's so cool. Have you came across footwork by chance? Chicago-based sort of genre of music.
Food work?
Footwork.
How do you spell that?
Footwork. Footwork. It's a genre.
No, I have not.
Based from Chicago. It's associated with a dance. So it's like 140 beats per minute. It's sort of like tempo, speeding hi-hats and stuff. It's very rhythmic. It's dance music. It can go up to like 160 beats per minute, 180. It's also known as juke, Chicago juke. But yeah, it's like there's like artists like RP Boo and stuff who create in that sort of range, and it's amazing how linked it is to dancing, because they sort of go hand in hand. The dance goes with the experience of music. Like if you go and look at videos online, someone often dancing to it is the sort of, yeah.
Huh.
So I love the relation.
What does it sound like?
I would describe it, just rhythmic, sort of often sampled, or, maybe someone will record a 7th chord and sort of start just transposing it. And just fast drums, fast tempo. Can have like sort of some tracks and have sort of choppy, jazzy feel, but very like, again, it can use polyrhythms, and yeah, it's somewhere between hip hop and pop, house, sort of. Yeah, it's a fusion. It's fascinating sort of genre, and yeah, I really like it and love the relation to dance. It has.
Yeah, I will definitely have to look into that. Okay. Do you have you ever composed specifically for dance? Like, is that something you've ever thought about?
I've had some songs that definitely the whole intention is they're a dance track. So it comes with a tempo. It's knowing what kind of works for a sort of dance orientated song. Bass is particularly important, I feel. It's often a driving force for dance, especially the rhythm of how it's done. They compose a sort of psychedelic rock, sort of pop song. It's called Can You Feel the Heat? And the bass was just sort of, it was a bit bouncy, and I felt like, yeah, adding sort of piano, guitar and everything over it, getting this sense of like when you're dancing and making it almost. I was collaborating with sort of 2 friends, and they were sort of dancing as it was being constructed, and I feel like it has that infectiousness, then that's the sort of sign. It like compels you in some way. It's something you can't always intellectualize or bring into words sometimes, because it's something so deeply intuitive. It has to connect with you individually. That the music has to be like flowing through you in some way. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It always amuses me because I often dance to stuff that is either noise music or noise adjacent. And like, I guess technically there's bass, but with that kind of dance, I'm usually following more the I'll pick like one or two timbres that I will kind of move in time with, as opposed to like following a steady beat. It's more of like this force that is assailing you and you're just riding it out.
Exactly. That's it. Wow. You know, I feel like sorry, please go ahead. I was just going to say, you know, the sort of early days of discovering Michael Jackson, Billie Jean, and the danceability of that song. I think that's the root itself. Like, that's the frame of reference I have personally, is Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. Just that sort of instrumental, that bass line, that whole thing. That might be one of the frames of references to like danceability as a thing. Like, how does it, it showcases this sort of ultimate harmony of texture, aestheticism, everything fit into like that pocket to compel you. It's sort of undeniable what it does, but it's sort of, if you want to see behind the mysticism, it's probably that song compelling it, you know, it's probably that. Yeah.
Do you have any other questions that come to mind?
In terms of this, I'm interested in podcasts. I've got quite a few friends who do podcasts, and I think it's beautiful. Where do you see, in terms of this podcast, where does it have a certain destination? Is it just to get the insights of as much artists as possible? And to add to that, have you watched things like Louisiana channel that kind of interview certain artists? Because I've been into that lately, and that's been very interesting.
I had, it was probably a year ago, I watched like everything on the Louisiana channel, YouTube channel. I'm really into that sort of thing. I have not done that recently, come to think of it. But that's basically the idea of this channel, or this podcast started because I had been watching the Louisiana channel, and then I also do video art, and I wanted to find other people doing video art and just hear them get interviewed. Like, what are they doing? How do they do it? Why do they do it? And I couldn't find it. There was basically no content of video artists specifically getting interviewed. There's a very small amount of content about experimental filmmakers. Like, there's a podcast, I think it's called Into the Mothlight, but that's more like I guess like film festival people. It's film. It's not here's a small chunk of art that happens to be in the video medium. And so I scheduled a bunch of interviews for those sorts of people, and then I just kind of expanded it from there and started scheduling other creative types. And that's really the point of this, is just to talk to people that maybe are not so well known that they're at film festivals, or maybe they're not in museums or not so often. The Louisiana channel isn't reaching out to you begging for an interview. And hear from those people, or like people that make like really weird, trippy indie video games. I interviewed one of those people a couple weeks ago. Just talk to those people.
Cool. It's funny how that came up. I guess it was just sort of it's something I've been exploring lately. It's beautiful that it's connected in that way too. There's great sort of content of Patti Smith. I feel like she's got this great monologue that sort of talks about the life of the artist and sort of all the pitfalls before sort of the realization that it's a beautiful experience itself or whatever. It's just very like poetic. I remember being particularly touched by that, because you got to be careful not to romanticize this this side of life where it's like there's nothing quite romantic about being a starving artist or anything. That's not something wise, I think, to wish for. You know, it's wanting to sort of meet this middle ground of like allowing it to be a living, without exploitation of any kind, without sort of a need for excess. But you know, when you've arrived there, like that kind of moment, yeah, I think that's where there's like a that's ideal. That's a good place to reach for, is in spite of all romanticization, embrace the romanticization, but also find some footing on the ground.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. My approach is that I just I make precisely what I want to make, and then I have a day job.
Oh no. Well, it depends how you see it. Is it something that is a hindrance, this day job, or is it something that maybe supplements the art?
Well, a lot of the art I make is specifically occult, meaning it involves techniques that alter your consciousness and can radically change your psychology or the aspects of your life. Whether or not you believe in spooky supernatural stuff, you can still fuck with your mind, you know? And a certain amount of that is necessary if you want to, I don't think advance is quite the right word, maybe develop along those lines. But if you go too quickly, I have seen people literally go insane and get, thankfully, temporarily institutionalized. But yeah, like the world is riddled with acid freaks, just to give a secular example. So it's good to have something to pin you down. It's good to have a steady income that you can rely on, even if your latest thing you've made doesn't necessarily is not easily commercialized or marketed, doesn't have an easy way to extract wealth somehow. And I kind of hate that terminology as well, even though that is just the world we live in. So it's good to not go too fast if that is the kind of art you are doing.
Isn't it Jung that says the mind is metaphysical? So I completely feel where you're coming from in terms of the mind itself is it's essentially a trip in terms of it's so highly curated, yet not fully at times aware of its own curation, and that it's so inbuilt, conditioning so strong that you are essentially just in autopilot going through the same motion a lot of people seem to experience at, typical 9 to 5s that maybe don't align with what they feel their purpose is. And that's such a funny one, because even the purpose of the artist, I'm sure at times you feel almost aimless of it, in terms of there's an absence due to the nature of impermanence sometimes of like, is this really my purpose? You may have made infinite amounts of work in this area, yet if it's not currently with you in terms of your wheelhouse of what you would do in your actual day, if it's not something you're engaging with, maybe due to taking a break or you're just not particularly inspired, there is that moment of this in-between of, does this really exist? Is this, am I just projecting onto this thing? And some may describe it as imposter syndrome, where that's such a funny thing too, where it's being challenged of like, are you capable enough to carry out this task to the extent of what you believe it should be? And these things often are a double-edged sword, but you've got to see them as positives, because, for example, imposter syndrome for me means picking up more instruments and challenging myself in different ways that I want to sort of not necessarily ever. I'm aware of the voice in terms of you're never going to fully appease this thing. This is the sort of nature of the human condition, is battling with perfectionism itself. It's where like the myth of Sisyphus comes from, where it's, you know, the constant back and forth of building for the thing just to essentially, for the flame to finally fizzle out, or for the death of that period of creativity, whatever the project is, whatever that frame of life is. It's about seeing through that, and I guess seeing the actual journey itself, and just continuing to ultimately stay curious and have fun in it, I feel.
Yeah, you definitely... I don't know if I would use the word fun, but it's got to be rewarding. And I think I saw this on the internet, so I'm not going to take credit for it. But one strategy for dealing with the imposter syndrome is to just lean into it. Yes, I am so good at being an imposter. I made it this far. Right? And if you're an occultist, like some of the listeners are, just think of it as being like a trickster god, or Hermes, or the god of thieves, right? Hermes, Hermeticism. Doctors changed their symbol from the staff of Asclepius to the sign of Hermes. You just not even fake it until you make it. But that is your what you're doing. You're shape-shifting, method acting. I don't know. Now I'm just spitballing.
No, beautiful. Shape-shifting is a wonderful descriptor. I had a question in terms of magic with a K and your relation to it. To what extent does that go? Because before I've dug into research pockets of esotericism and stuff, just out of curiosity. I mean, there's people that have sort of graced like more mainstream culture, Aleister Crowley, and the great work, right? This idea to reach enlightenment, it's to accumulate this sort of whatever you've been given. There's a sort of idea of a predestined idea, like gift or some sort of tool as an individual you're predisposed to. It's about using it to create your great work, and that's your enlightenment to the next. Yeah, it's your form of it in terms of like, that perspective. I'm wondering, I guess, where do you sit in amidst all that is magic?
That is a good question. So I have not read everything Aleister Crowley has written, but I have read plenty of it, some of it more than once. Some of it I've committed to memory if it's useful. But I'm not a Thelemite. Thelema, however you say it. I don't know Greek. I haven't joined the OTO. I've gone to some of their meetings. I kind of do my own thing. Often, so I would call myself a chaos magician, which is, in my case, it's basically when you use occult techniques to build up your own system that is idealized for your purposes. And I could ramble a lot about that because I have 7 books published on those topics. But yeah, that's where I'm at. I'm more of a mystic than a magician, or maybe I should say more of a mystic than a sorcerer, in that I don't tend to, on rare occasion will I use ritual to try to manifest something external to myself. Usually it's more about obtaining particular kinds of wisdom and internal development such that my desires become manifest, if that makes sense. Like I would, if I wanted more money, I would sooner do rituals to change myself and my immediate surroundings such that the money becomes more plentiful, and maybe that I'm more easily able to save it or invest it wisely, whatever, than I would do a ritual to just get money. I've done sigils in the past where I manifest the thing and it's gone in a week. So I'm more of a wisdom seeker than someone seeking riches and fame. That doesn't usually seem to go well. I guess some people are lucky. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it does. It's a funny one because I have interest. It's not what I've fully explored or anything. It's something I've sort of stayed on the outskirts and sort of looking at and appreciating its sort of place. I mean, I look to things like astronomy and get out of almost the physical sphere altogether. And I feel like it has this sort of weird, there's a strange therapeuticness to it in the sense of seeing this reckoning of the universe itself, and even like the recycling of nature and how it's developing and stuff beyond us. It helps sort of relinquish the need to be something, if that makes sense. I think that's the ultimate place of creativity, is like relinquish of the need to be something or somebody, or it's be formless, you know, sort of true formlessness in the sense that you're not attached to anything. It could even be some accolades, it could be something like good, but to be completely formless is sort of I feel like the ultimate place of creativity or exploration, period.
Yeah, I can get that for sure. My brain just goes to the fact that there are plenty of people that we would call creative who were definitely chasing accolades at a minimum. So, I don't know. I don't like to say that something is true creativity or not, but that flow state, or that state of formlessness, is definitely a wonderful source. All right. Well, we are getting to the end of our show. Do you have anything that you would like to plug?
Nothing to plug, just to say new music from my band Social Indirection is underway. New album. Just, tap into the music if you want to. That's it. Thank you for having me on here in your time and the lovely chat.
Yeah, it's been great.